One of the most popular critics of resurrection apologetics, at least within the online sphere, is Richard Carrier. I feel compelled here to mention that Carrier has a PhD, since his fans will whine and complain about it in the comments if I don't. Carrier's approach to arguing against the resurrection is, in some respects, similar to Bart Ehrman's, and is, in other respects, quite different. Carrier's article, The Spiritual Body of Christ and the Legend of the Empty Tomb, is well over 100 pages long, and represents his basic approach to dismissing the significance of the New Testament evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. In short, Carrier's hypothesis involves the idea that Paul is our earliest source for the resurrection of Jesus. For Carrier, Paul had some type of hallucination, which, in conjunction with his own questionable readings of the Hebrew Scriptures, convinced him that Jesus had risen from the dead. As he explains, I believe the best explanation, consistent with both scientific findings and the surviving evidence, is that the first Christians experienced hallucinations of the risen Christ of one form or another. However, Carrier does not believe that Paul thought of this as a resurrection of the same body which Jesus inhabited on earth. The body remained in the tomb and decomposed there. Rather, for Carrier, Paul thought of Jesus' soul as receiving a spiritual or non-physical body in heaven. The Gospels, then, represent an evolving legend where certain Christians began interpreting the resurrection body as a physical body, and the empty tomb was an idea which naturally grew out of this general trend of development. As he explains, the evidence suggests that the first Christians, at least up to and including Paul, thought Christ's soul was taken up to heaven and clothed in a new body, after leaving his old body in the grave forever. The subsequent story, that Jesus actually walked out of the grave with the same body that went into it, leaving an empty tomb to astonish all, was probably a legend that developed over the course of the first century, beginning with a metaphorical empty tomb in the Gospel of Mark, most likely written after Paul's death. Most of the discussion surrounding Carrier's hypothesis has centered on the idea that Paul thought of Jesus' resurrected body as being non-physical. In particular, there is much debate regarding the merits of his reading of Paul's statement that the resurrection body is a spiritual body in 1 Corinthians 15:44. The question regards whether or not Paul means to say that the resurrected body is not physical when he describes it as spiritual. Does his contrast between a natural body and a spiritual body contrast the metaphysical composition of these bodies? The answer is probably negative. James P. Ware summarizes the basic difficulties with this reading as follows. 1. There is no evidence in Paul's letters that the notion of spirit matter had any place in his thought, and such a notion has no connections to Paul's thought elsewhere. 2. The notion that verse 44 introduces the concept of a new body, distinct in substance from the body sown in death, misunderstands the structure of Paul's syntax in this verse. The implied grammatical subject of the verbs in verse 44 is the mortal fleshly body that is sown in decay, but thereafter raised to immortal life, and thus describes two contrasting modes of existence of this same body, one prior to the resurrection and the other following the resurrection. 3. The understanding of this body as involving a body composed of spirit, distinct in substance from the fleshly body, entirely ignores the actual lexical meaning and usage within Paul and within the wider ancient world of the key terms in question. This view is thus routinely bedeviled by the gratuitous assumption that the contrast Paul draws in 1544 is that of flesh and spirit. Additionally, earlier in 1 Corinthians 2:14-15, Paul contrasted the natural man with the spiritual man, by which he seems to be referencing unbelievers and believers. Presumably, Paul is not intending to convey that believers have immaterial bodies simply because he describes them as being spiritual. As Mike Licona puts it, it is clear here that Paul is not contrasting physical beings with ethereal ones. Rather, he is contrasting those governed or animated by their fleshly and sinful desires and who think in accordance with the world's wisdom with those governed by holy desires and heavenly wisdom centered on God. In other words, when employing the terms natural and spiritual, Paul is not referring to the substance of the old and new bodies, but rather their mode of existence. While I appreciate scholars like Ware and Licona who have criticized Carrier's idea that Paul did not believe the resurrected body was physical, and I think that they are right that Carrier is misreading Paul, there is a serious risk involved in letting the debate focus on this point. That risk is that it lets Carrier choose the battlefield by giving off the impression that the case for the resurrection must be primarily based on 1 Corinthians 15. Since my preferred argument for the resurrection privileges the testimony of the Gospels, this affords me an opportunity to present another way of responding to Carrier's arguments, which is constantly overlooked and, in my view, much more robust. In addition to the heavy focus on Carrier's spiritual resurrection hypothesis, many objections to Carrier have focused on the adequacy of hallucinations to explain the resurrection appearances. For example, in his nearly 400-page critique of Carrier, S. Ross Hickling devotes more than 100 pages to objecting to the adequacy of hallucinations to account for the multisensory appearances of Jesus to multiple people at a time, and even to skeptical individuals like Thomas, according to the Gospels. As Hickling explains, in regard to the way in which Jesus Christ was experienced after his resurrection, in line with other religious traditions, if Jesus was experienced as a hallucination by the disciples, then he would have appeared in a glorious form. However, the risen Jesus Christ is nowhere depicted as having a glowing or grand appearance that those viewing him would be in awe of. Instead of this, it is observed that the appearance of Jesus in bodily form is altogether ordinary. The disciple Thomas, who did not believe that Jesus Christ had arisen from the dead, was convinced that it was Jesus after he encountered him. This is relevant to Carrier's discussion regarding hallucinating disciples, as Thomas did not even believe that Jesus Christ had arisen from the dead. So if Thomas did not believe that the other disciples had seen the risen Jesus Christ already, then how would he be predisposed in a group setting to hallucinate the risen Jesus Christ? But for all the good points which Hickling makes, they are simply misplaced against Carrier. For Carrier does not grant that the resurrection appearances, as they are described in the Gospels, ever actually occurred. Those are not the sorts of appearances which his hallucination hypothesis is intended to explain. Rather, Carrier intends for hallucinations to partially account for the initial belief of Paul. Paul's resurrection experience is insulated from the sort of defense Hickling is offering, since Paul doesn't provide us with any details about what his experience was like. The Gospel accounts, in Carrier's view, are later legendary developments rather than the testimony of eyewitnesses. As he says, it is also possible that Matthew relates an actual hallucinatory experience, but we need not assume this. Either way, the passage offers no proof that Matthew's appearance tradition derives from any real encounter with a flesh and bone Jesus. The appearance tradition in Matthew is highly stylized. If Matthew is drawing on or reworking any actual appearance tradition, then the tradition contained no real support for a resurrection of the flesh. So having clarified what exactly Carrier's hypothesis says, we are better positioned to see which premise of my argument for the resurrection is targeted. Carrier, like Ehrman, objects to the second premise. He contests that the gospel accounts cannot be relied upon as evidence for the resurrection because they do not come from people who were in a position to know whether or not Jesus was physically raised from the dead. Carrier's objection to the use of the Gospels depends critically on the assumption that they are late and legendary. Without that, he cannot legitimately limit the scope of the discussion to the writings of Paul. So rather than following in the long line of scholars who have critiqued Carrier on the grounds that Paul did not believe in a spiritual resurrection, I will instead focus on Carrier's case for the Gospels being late and unreliable. While I do think that Carrier is wrong in how he interprets Paul, this territory has been well trodden by others. By instead focusing on Carrier's attempts to remove the Gospels from the discussion, I will be able to pioneer a different sort of response to Carrier, and thereby contribute something original to the discussion. Carrier begins his discussion of why we should discount the Gospels from serious consideration by offering a scattershot of common skeptical objections pertaining to the sources of the Gospels. He writes, "In the generation after Paul, someone wrote what was probably the first ever account of the Gospel of Jesus Christ. Tradition has assigned that book to an unknown author named Mark, according to legend, Peter's scribe. It is not known when the book was written. Most scholars believe it was sometime around 70 CE, give or take a decade, but it is clear that Paul knew nothing of the work, so we can be fairly certain it was not circulating when he was alive. Yet this gospel contains the first known appearance of an empty tomb story. All other accounts rely on it and basically just embellish it or modify it to suit each author's own narrative and ideological agenda. As nearly all scholars agree, Matthew and Luke clearly used Mark as their source, repeating the same elements in the same order and often using identical vocabulary and word order, not only for this story, but for the whole gospel. And though John does not directly use Mark as a source, it is probable his account ultimately derives from it. Beyond mere conjecture, there is no indication any of them had any other source of information for the changes and additions they make. So I count 4 distinct objections here. First, the gospel authors are unknown. Second, the gospels must be late because Paul never cites any of them. Third, Matthew, Luke, and John are just embellishments of Mark. And fourth, the gospel authors had no sources of information beyond Mark. Let's consider each one. First, in my video, Who Wrote the Gospels? The Case for Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, I offered a detailed case against Carrier's claim that the authors of the Gospels are unknown. All Carrier has to say in defense of this is that the attribution of Mark as being Peter's scribe is legendary. But the earliest source for this is Papias of Hierapolis, who was writing, as I argued in my video on the historical reliability of Acts, as early as the 90s AD. Since Carrier dates Mark to around 70 AD, we are dealing with a period of only 20 to 30 years. Moreover, I have argued that Papias knew the apostles themselves. Hence we have no reason whatsoever to conclude that the attribution of the second gospel to Mark is legendary, and the same is true of the other gospels. Second, Carrier suggests that the gospels must be late because Paul never cites Mark, and he assumes that the other gospels are later than Mark. So if Mark was written after the writings of the apostle Paul, then so are the other gospels. But even if we granted this point in its entirety, nothing particularly significant follows from it. Recall that Paul would have likely died sometime in between 64 and 68 AD. So even if all of the Gospels are written after this, that doesn't automatically place them outside of the lives of their purported authors. In other words, it doesn't automatically make them too late to be trusted as sources. Furthermore, it can be disputed that Paul does not cite any of the Gospels. For example, in 1 Corinthians 11:23-25, Paul says, "For I received from the Lord that which I also delivered to you, that the Lord Jesus, on the night when he was betrayed, took bread, and, when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, 'This is my body which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me.' In the same way, he also took the cup after supper, saying, 'This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this, as often as you drink it, in remembrance of me.'" These words closely match Jesus' words as recorded in Luke 22:18-20. It is not impossible to suppose that Paul is directly quoting from Luke's Gospel. He does claim, after all, to have received this information from somewhere prior to teaching it to the Corinthian church. As Greg Boyd and Paul Eddy observe, no one disputes that Paul's words here strongly parallel the account of the Last Supper found in all four Gospels, especially Luke's. The text itself suggests Paul is relying on traditional material. He introduces his material with standard Jewish terminology for receiving and handing over sacred tradition. This suggests that Paul was passing on material that had been passed on to him by others. In this light, when Paul says he received from the Lord this teaching, it seems most natural to take him to be referring to his conviction that this traditional material goes back to the Lord's own words and actions. Through the tradition now being mediated through Paul, the Corinthians were receiving from the Lord the teaching about the Last Supper. This conclusion is confirmed by the fact that Paul's words betray a wholly fixed verbal form, as is seen when compared with Luke 22:19-20. This is all the more plausible if, as some scholars have suggested, Paul is referring to the Gospel of Luke when he uses the phrase, "according to my gospel," throughout his epistles. Since Luke is traditionally thought to have been a companion of Paul, and since I take the evidence to be strong that Luke authored the third Gospel, there is a compelling alternative to viewing this connection between 1 Corinthians 11 and Luke 22 as a mere coincidence. Additionally, some scholars have thought that Paul's eschatological statements in 1st and 2nd Thessalonians may show dependence upon Matthew 24. Similarities in themes, as well as the phenomenon of distinctively Matthean vocabulary turning up in Paul here, are highly suggestive. As Bernard Orchard argues, prescinding from attaching any specific dates to any of the Gospels, but being open to the possibility of early dating, the evidence will be outlined here for Paul's use of the literary tradition as found in our Greek Matthew. The case of 1st and 2nd Thessalonians offer the best and clearest example of Paul's adaptation of the eschatological teaching found chiefly in Matthew. In Matthew 23-25, and in the eschatological section of both letters, we find the same teaching, the same metaphors and similes, and the same key words, some exceedingly rare. Paul is seen to utilize the same key words and the same illustrations that Matthew uniquely uses with regard to the suddenness of the coming of the Lord, like a thief in the night, like the sudden birth pangs, like the sudden arrival of the bridegroom, like the sudden coming of the flood while life was going on normally, a coming in power and glory, with the angels and with the sound of a great trumpet. Other powerful supporting reminiscences of Matthew are found in Galatians and 1 Corinthians. Of course, it is certain that Paul made full use of Old Testament eschatological imagery, but some extra details that he himself adds are found together only in Matthew and argue strongly for his first-hand knowledge of it. And in his excellent book, the sayings of Jesus in the churches of Paul, David Dungan argues extensively that Matthean and Lucan themes can be found throughout the Pauline corpus. He suggests that the evidence here is just as strong as for supposing that various New Testament books influenced many of the patristic writers. As he explains, although a Tertullian and an Irenaeus may have succeeded most of the time in keeping their citations explicit and unscrambled, the same thing cannot be said for Justin Martyr, or 2nd Clement, or 1st Clement. In them, however, the degree of explicitness is clearly on the rise. But if we go back farther to someone like Polycarp or Ignatius or the Apostolic Fathers, we can see much less explicit citation of traditional material. The argument that Paul knew only a few sayings because he only mentions a few openly falls to the ground, and the numerous verbal correspondences between his text and those of the Synoptic Gospels, as well as other more distantly related parallels in ethical exhortation, show that Paul actually used or cited a considerable number of Jesus' teachings. Now, of course, Carrier can try to argue that the dependence goes in the other direction. He might try to suggest that Matthew and Luke are drawing this information from Paul rather than the other way around. I'm not interested in pursuing that question right now. The point is just that Carrier cannot be too confident that Paul does not demonstrate knowledge of the Gospels. This is far from a foregone conclusion. Moving on to Carrier's third objection, he suggests that when we look at the resurrection narratives side by side in chronological order, we can actually see the story evolving by getting more fantastic with each new entry. As he says, it cannot reasonably be doubted that the Gospels exhibit legendary embellishments upon the basic story of Mark. However much you might quibble about which elements were invented, it is clear at least some were. Mark tells a simple story about a Sanhedrinist burying Jesus, women going to the tomb and finding it open, meeting a single boy in white, then running off. But by the time we get to Matthew, Joseph has become a disciple of Jesus who buried Jesus in his own new tomb, the boy has become an angel descending from heaven, the women experience a massive earthquake and watch the angel descend and open the tomb, and guards have been added to the story. There can be no doubt that we are looking at extensive legendary embellishment. We can see the same trend in the other two Gospels. Luke, unaware of Matthew, and less prone to the fabulous, also embellished the story received from Mark, though less excitingly. John borrowed some of the embellishments of Luke, but makes the story entirely his own. Now, quite obviously, Carrier's objection here is entirely dependent upon his preferred synoptic theory. In particular, it depends upon the thesis of Markan priority. Regular viewers of this channel will know that I am quite skeptical of Markan priority. I have dedicated several videos to arguing for the thesis that Matthew was, in fact, the first gospel written, and that Mark was actually the last of the synoptics to have been written. Clearly, if this sort of synoptic theory is correct, then there is not a clear evolution of the resurrection narrative. Instead, the level of detail in each narrative simply varies without any discernible evolutionary trajectory. This would increase the plausibility of the idea that the level of detail in each resurrection narrative is simply reflecting the preferences of the respective authors rather than a growing legend. But even granting Markan priority, we still don't have as clear a case of an evolving legend as Carrier would have you believe. Of all the Gospels, it is Matthew who has the most elaborate resurrection narrative, complete with an angel descending from heaven and an earthquake. Yet even by Carrier's own reckoning, Matthew is only the second Gospel to have been written. This already begins to shake up the smooth progression from less fantastic to more fantastic, which Carrier would like you to believe exists among the resurrection narratives. As David Wood points out, in John, we find an impressive amount of fish in the net, and Jesus appears in a locked room. Luke is more stunning, with Jesus vanishing instantly and later ascending into heaven. Matthew is the most spectacular, however. He records a violent earthquake, an angel grabbing the stone and rolling it back, and several dead people coming back to life and roaming the streets of Jerusalem. Notice that the pattern of evolution proceeds in exactly the opposite direction required by this theory. And Carrier's analysis ignores independent reasons to believe that the Gospel authors are at least attempting to be historically accurate. If these reasons are taken seriously, then this further increases the likelihood that we are dealing with different preferences of the respective authors rather than a growing legend. Turning now to Carrier's fourth objection, how can he possibly claim to know that the Gospel authors had no sources of information beyond Mark? This certainly assumes that Matthew and John were not written by apostles of Jesus who would have had their own experiences from which to draw. But Carrier has done nothing to argue against this. John, in particular, has a verse directly saying that it was authored by an apostle of Jesus in John 21:24. Carrier briefly addresses this by saying, John claims to derive from an unnamed eyewitness, but only in a section of his gospel that looks like it was added by a different author. Now, I actually agree with Carrier that John 21:24 probably was added by another author, likely Papias, shortly after John's own death, and I defended such a hypothesis in my video on gospel authorship. But that does not change the fact that the verse directly says that the gospel was written by an eyewitness. Carrier's implication seems to be that this statement cannot be trusted if it did not come from the author's own hand. I frankly find it doubtful that Carrier would believe John was authored by an eyewitness, even if John 21:24 were written by the same author as the rest of the gospel. In any case, this is, at the very least, evidence that the author of the fourth gospel did have access to information besides Mark. Minimally, this verse shows that the gospel was believed to have been written by an eyewitness from very early on. Carrier has not done anything to refute this. And then what about the Gospel of Luke? Luke is explicit in his prologue that he has used other sources. Carrier is well aware of this, saying, Luke does claim to have many sources, but does not say who or for what material, so this can be of no help here. But for Carrier to complain about the fact that Luke doesn't name his sources is to miss the point. Carrier's claim is that Luke has no access to sources beyond Mark for his resurrection narratives. This statement in Luke's prologue gives us at least some reason to believe that this is not true. Furthermore, Luke actually does tell us who his sources are, at least in a very broad way. He identifies his sources as being eyewitnesses. I would suggest that at least one of those eyewitness accounts is certainly the Gospel of Matthew. Later in the article, Carrier asserts his conviction that Matthew and Luke are independent of one another, saying, we can see the same trend in the other two Gospels. Luke, unaware of Matthew, and less prone to the fabulous, also embellished the story received from Mark, though less excitingly. It seems that in 2005, when The Empty Tomb was published, Carrier still affirmed something like the two-source hypothesis, where Matthew and Luke both independently used Mark, and a lost source called Q. However, Carrier himself has not been able to sustain this. For as of at least 2017, Carrier has defended the Farrer hypothesis, which explicitly asserts that Luke knew Matthew's gospel. As Carrier says, what is simpler, that Matthew and Luke used two sources, one of whom we can only hypothesize the existence of? or that Matthew used one source and made the rest up, and Luke only used Mark and Matthew and made the rest up. The latter theory requires no ad hoc hypothetical sources. It relies solely on evidence and texts we actually have. It is therefore the much simpler hypothesis. And on top of that, it turns out, unlike evidence for Q, there actually is concrete evidence Luke copied Matthew. Carrier seems unaware of how this flies in the face of his explanation for how the resurrection narratives in the Gospels emerged. His acceptance of the fairer hypothesis undercuts his evolutionary hypothesis in at least two ways. First, it refutes his claim that Luke was not working from any sources besides Mark. It entails that Luke was using Matthew as well. And if, as I have argued, Matthew was authored by an eyewitness, then this should increase our confidence in Luke's assertion in his prologue that he obtained his information from eyewitnesses. For in the one case where we can confirm his source, we can confirm that it was an eyewitness. Second, the fairer hypothesis challenges Carrier's story about how the resurrection narratives grew with each subsequent installment. The earlier quotation, where Carrier expressed his prior belief that Luke was independent of Matthew, was intended to explain why Luke's narrative looked less fantastic than Matthew's. The explanation was that Luke just didn't know about Matthew's embellishments, but he was still embellishing Mark. However, now that Carrier has acknowledged Luke's dependence upon Matthew, this excuse is no longer open to him. He has to come to terms with the fact that, on his hypothesis, Luke had Matthew's greatly embellished version of Mark, and yet chose to tell a less embellished version of the story. Needless to say, this doesn't square well with his idea that the resurrection story just kept growing as time went on. To conclude, this section has reviewed Richard Carrier's case against the historicity of the resurrection. We have seen reason to doubt both his interpretation of Paul's doctrine of the resurrection, as well as his story for how the resurrection narratives within the Gospels came to fruition. Carrier does not justify his claim that we don't know who wrote the Gospels. There are reasons to suspect that he is wrong about Paul being wholly ignorant about the Gospel resurrection traditions. There are reasons to suspect that he is wrong about Paul being wholly ignorant about the Gospel resurrection traditions. His claim that the resurrection narratives can be seen as an evolving legend do not actually fit the pattern which we find among them, and his claim that the Gospel authors had no reliable sources of information is simply unsustainable.